to the Weekly Bioanalysis, a KCAS podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the 27th episode of the Weekly Bioanalysis. My name is Dominic Guarino, and I'm the Senior Scientific Advisor for Ligand Binding Assays, Biomarkers, and Flow Cytometry here at KCAS. I've been with KCAS for about 7 years, but I've been in the bioanalytical space for close to 26 years. I'm here with my co-host, John Perkins.
Hello, I'm John Perkins, Senior Scientific Advisor with a focus on all technologies LCMS related. I've been with KCS just over a year, but I've been in the bioanalytical space somewhere over 26 years.
Today's podcast, as always, is brought to you by KCAS Bioanalytical and Biomarker Services. KCS is a bioanalytical laboratory located in Kansas City, Kansas, servicing the pharmaceutical and biotech industries for over 40 years now. John and I are senior scientific advisors at KCS, and either or both of us are available to answer any questions you may have regarding this podcast or any of KCS services. We are glad that you are tuning into us today. As mentioned, this will be our 27th recording of the podcast. And if you're interested in other episodes, they can be found at KCS Bio. And as a reminder, if you are interested in any other episodes of the podcast, they can be found at kcsbio.com. As a reminder, you can follow us on Twitter at The Weekly Bio and at KCS Bio. If you are new to the podcast, John and I are in completely different places. I'm here in Kansas. John is in upstate New York. And our producer, Jeremy, is in the Midwest somewhere, maybe in the Columbia, Missouri area. This weekly podcast gives us a chance to get to know all of you. And more importantly, it's a chance for you to get to know us. If you want to know any further information about KCS and the services provide, please do hit us up online. As always, the podcast will be a review of the latest news and resources, and then a focus on a topic of our choosing before discussing any feedback we've had. As always, we're constantly looking for topics, and we'd be happy to discuss something that you want us to cover. So get out there and post, please. Then we will wrap up and give you a little teaser for next week, letting you know what is coming up in the future. So we look forward to a fun episode today. To kick us off for podcast number 27, John is going to go over today's podcast topic a bit before we jump into the news and resources. Hey, John.
So our agenda, as usual, will follow pretty much the same format. So we're going to touch on the news and resources with a big focus on COVID because there's been a lot of developments this week. Then some non-COVID news, and then we'll move into the main portion of the podcast, which is a discussion of the 2010 Fierce 15, Where Are They Now? And we'll give more explanation as to what that's about when we get to the actual topic.
Yeah, John, let's jump right into our COVID news. First item is related to COVID vaccines, obviously. And John, we've got the big news, John, is the Pfizer BioNTech, right? And 90% efficacy. You know, their stock went up, but this is making national news. I think it's kind of instilling a little bit of confidence in the pharma and biopharma industries around a vaccine that's 90% effective. Why don't you tell us a little bit more, and then I'll share some thoughts about it.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, my thought is it's incredible. Not just as Pfizer announced they've got 90% efficacy after looking at where 164 patients have hit their end point of getting infected. Data was readout was from 94 patients. Their next readout will be based on 164. They got 144,000 patients enrolled in their trial. It's moving forward. They've announced that it's 90% effective in preventing COVID-19, but it's also the fact that you've got, other vaccines are in its wake. Moderna are expected to announce soon. You've got several others are close by, and what is so incredible that this is 10 months into the pandemic, whereas prior vaccine development times are multi-years, where you're talking to get to this stage before you even got a chance to roll it. So it's a real kudos to the pharma companies and what they've done in terms of working to roll this out. The Pfizer one, which I do want to touch on, has certainly some potential drawbacks to it, but let's have your thoughts on just this announcement.
Yeah, I think the the speed at which we've gotten to where we are is, I don't like the word unprecedented, but it really is. Like we've probably condensed a vaccine's cycle is, so we talked about this before, it can range from anywhere from 5 to like 15 years depending upon it, and things have been expedited, I think, due to all the collaboration and resources and focus, right? Those are the things that allow for things to move at warp speed, as it was called. I think it's, I am um, pleasantly surprised by the um, how rapid how quickly we've gotten to where we are right now. Um, there's still probably some things that I wonder. I hope we're not skipping around. Let's say age and even pediatrics, but overall, John, this is just something that the country needed. I'm just so happy we've got what looks like not only one vaccine candidate, but maybe multiple. But it really has moved at a rate that, when we started this podcast back, 8 months ago now, we didn't think we'd be as far along um, to as where we are today. The I think the speed hasn't compromised the quality of the vaccine. At least I don't feel like it has. I think it's just been condensed due to resources and focus.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of quality, the FDA announced several months ago that they would consider a vaccine to move forward if it showed 50% effectiveness. And here we have the first one out talking 90%. I mean, for Pfizer, their next steps is, like I say, is to hit data from 164 patients to show that they've got at least 2 months worth of safety data before they can then ask the FDA for an emergency use authorization. So, based on everything, they're thinking the earliest that they'll apply for that is around Thanksgiving. But they're also talking they could have 50 million doses this side of 2021, jumping to 1.3 billion next year. So, obviously, then it becomes the question of who get who is prioritized to get the dose, assuming that people want to be dosed. We'll touch on that later. But then, one other
Yeah.
thing. Another thing, you have to emphasise this is an early readout, but there's been no major safety implications so far. But then the big elephant in the room with the Pfizer vaccine, it's effective, but we've talked about this many other times, is its lack of stability at temperatures that make the logistics easy. So it's very limited stability, either refrigerated or minus 20 degrees C. It really does need to be kept at minus 70 degrees C as long as possible. It is a 2-dose vaccine, so again, that's going to play. So when you talk about the 1.3 billion doses, that's really effectively 650 million doses because it's a 2-step thing. But really, that need for the ultra low storage will impact where you can get it to, unless we really drastically beef up our freezer resources. And across the states, they're just not there yet. Pfizer have got designed special boxes for shipping, but they're talking large batches of tubes to ship those out. But the big concern are things like getting doses to rural areas, small towns, native communities, to migrant workers. But even in one of the articles that we looked at, I can't remember. There was one large hospital that was basically saying we don't have minus 70-degree freezers, and that's something we see in just supporting clinical trials, where often you develop an assay and the analyte is only stable at minus 70 degrees, but it's not at minus 20. But the clinical site that's already been chosen to support it only has minus 20 freezers. So it then impacts your downstream logistics of how you analyze those samples, because you've got that limited stability window. I'll let you chime in and then I'll come back to it.
Yeah, no, we talked about this as we kind of do our prep for the meeting here. Cold chain supply is going to be a huge issue with this vaccine. You touched on how, when in our world, well, look, I mean, we have lots of minus 80 freezes, but it's a constant battle as we're growing to put more in. They're big in size. They don't hold a whole bunch. I don't know if our audience knows what a minus 70 or minus 80 freezer looks like, but it's typical size of a refrigerator, and it's as you said, John. There's not a lot of in our world. We have to do studies of things at minus 20, right? Standard freezer for X amount of time, and then it gets into minus 80. So what I'm saying there is we actually do feasibility studies to show, okay, this clinic can store it at minus 20 for 60 days and then ship it to a central lab and then store it at minus 80 for, I don't know, a year or two. So now it becomes are we going to be seeing minus 80s in CVS, right? That's, I think, where you're going. Like, what does this mean if we're going to have to hold, you know, thousands or tens of thousands of vaccines in certain sites? So I think it's a problem, but one will probably not one for the U.S. Let me start there. Well, it'll slow down the distribution of it for sure, but I think over time we'll find a workaround here. But globally, it becomes a little bit more of a challenge.
Yeah, sure. Logistically, it's definitely not insurmountable. I think it's just there's time to prep, and I think one of the articles talked about states preparation, and I think it was Washington State currently doesn't have a warehouse that can store things at minus 80. But you can buy freezers, but then that does impact. Then that does sort of say, well, what's the supply chain of minus 80 freezers? What's the current delay? I mean, I still don't have an oven installed after I ordered it 3 months ago, and that really is the current supply chain that we're dealing with. So that will be part of it. It's certainly solvable. I mean, one thing that actually the Pfizer vaccine can survive in a refrigerator for 5 days, but it can't be refrozen if unused. So there's a little window there that if you set up things to administer,
those are scary though, John. Sorry to talk
absolutely.
over you. What you just described there around 5 days and refreezing, it's like, boy, we're still wondering if it's effective and producing long-term immunity, still a question. And so doing those things leads to immunogenicity, right? I want to point that out. Those types of manipulations of proteins and vaccines have led to the whole field of immunogenicity, because people were microwaving their injectable because it was too cold, right? So now, well, anyhow, that's an interesting thing that it can last for a couple days at standard refrigeration, but it is it's interesting.
It would be interesting to see the clinical instructions for administration of it, knowing it's been stored at minus 70 and what steps to go to before they then administer it to the patient.
Yeah, John, I think we could sit here and probably just spend the whole podcast talking about this fascinating vaccine. And maybe before we move off it, let's just mention the CureVac one is a similar mRNA vaccine, but doesn't require the minus 70. So that becomes, to me, an intriguing dark horse towards the vaccine space. Although we do have others that are in there, and we'll mention another one. But I thought it was important to mention that, hey, right behind it is somebody who's got a similar vaccine, or at least in terms of its mechanism and its design, that doesn't require this freezer. And I know this cold chain supply. I know you brought this up. Any final thoughts on that before we move on to our next topic?
Yeah, I've suddenly got just so you're aware, I've got a bunch of Outlook notifications coming in. I've got it completely shut down. Let's let those go, and then I will talk. This is ridiculous. The app was completely shut off. I've never seen anything like that. What the?
John, it has to happen during the middle of a recording. When else, right? I'm just glad it's you and not me, so Jeremy can laugh at you and have to cut this out, not me.
I've got it completely shut down. Anyway, I think we're good to go again. That should be the end of it. Just as you mentioned, the CureVac one, they say they have, I think, up to 3 months at 5 degrees C, so it doesn't have the same logistics issues. The Moderna is another mRNA-based vaccine, and they're talking minus 20 stability is okay for them. I think it's interesting about the CureVac, just to very quickly touch on it. I know we want to move on, but CureVac, basically, I think that the reason for their better stability is down to they've got a much more compact vaccine structure. So they've used natural mRNA for compact packaging inside their liquid nanoparticle formulation. So there's less attack surface for hydrolysis, preventing degradation, and then then not requiring such deep freezing. So yeah, it's very interesting. And then of course we've got J&J and others with its the single
Yeah.
dose, where that's a different sort of logistics that will impact that. But let's
Well,
move
John,
on.
yeah, I think I feel a podcast before the year is out, or maybe early in 2021. That's just like main topic is COVID vaccines and some
That'd
of
be
the
great.
details that
But
you just
so
said. That
let's
would be a
quickly
fun one.
touch
But
on.
speaking, no, go ahead.
Should quickly touch on some of the others. So obviously, we the ones that have been out there are the vaccines from China and Russia, and we don't get very much details about them. But Sinovac is one of the Chinese companies, and their vaccine is in phase 3 in Brazil, but had a death in the trial. But this actually, as it turns out, there's not much information, and the trial has been halted because of a patient death. But similar to the AstraZeneca trial, it was actually in the placebo arm. So I'm sure that it will probably crank back up. But it's interesting that this is actually one of the Chinese vaccines that has already been administered to large sectors
Yeah.
of the population in China.
And again, well, when we do our deep dive, I believe that one was an attenuated vaccine. But it's interesting how little information there is about the Chinese vaccines.
Let's move on to the next one. Is Sinopharm is one of the other Chinese high-profile vaccine. They're in phase 3, and they're talking about better than expected phase 3 vaccine data. But they don't. I mean, there isn't much. It isn't much information out there yet. They just said that it's doing well. But the interesting thing with Sinopharm is they're actually looking at 2 vaccines. So we know they say there's encouraging data, but we don't even know which of the 2 vaccines it refers to, or if it's to both of them. In the wake of Pfizer's announcement of 90% efficiency, Russia announced that their lead vaccine was also more than 90% effective. In fact, precisely 92% effective. I don't know if that was the case of them saying ours is better than yours, or quite what was going on there. But it uses a pair of adenovirus vectors to deliver a gene for the coronavirus spike protein inside human cells. But the readout was actually based on a much smaller group of cases. So where Pfizer was 94, the Russian one, from the National Research for the Russian one was based on, I think, 32 patients.
Correct.
So it's a much
Yeah,
smaller
and
group.
it's correct. It's the National Research Center for Epidemiology and Microbiology in Moscow. So it sounds like that's like not an actual company, but the Russian government that's claiming they got 92% efficacy over 32 cases. But looks like they've done 16,000 volunteers have received the second dose, or excuse me, got the first. 16,000 volunteers received a second dose, and then they're trying to give that up to 39,000. So similar numbers when it's all said and done. But you're right, the number of reported cases at 32 is slightly lower than Pfizer's 94. But it is funny that they made it a little bit better. This reminds me of like, Rocky 3 or something with them outbesting the US a little. But it'll be interesting to see.
And one last comment on the Russian one: logistics, you never can ignore it. Russia's obviously approved a couple of coronavirus vaccines, but very few people in the country have received it because of persistent manufacturing delays. So their plans for mass vaccination keep getting pushed back. So it's all very well getting the vaccine to approval. You still have to find a way of delivering it.
Well, yeah, that is, it's going to, obviously in Russia, it appears to be a major hurdle. It's still a hurdle here in the U.S. You constantly see how the Pfizers and the Modernas and everybody you see these hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in manufacturing companies to ensure they can make the vaccine, and constantly read about new plants being put up and ushered in for 2021. But any of that is going to be a problem as we get, if it's one vaccine, two shots, and you can envision the challenges with trying to vaccinate. We got like 380 million here in the U.S. alone, and now we're talking about freezer space, and it's just making my head hurt a little bit. But either way, it's really a good thing, and I want to leave it on a high note that this is still very exciting.
So yeah, I'm going to drag things down though, because our next article I want to talk about was an independent study by the Reagan Udall Foundation, who canvassed frontline workers, and it was in conjunction with the FDA. But the study finds fear and distrust among frontline workers and minority groups around COVID-19 vaccines.
Mm.
So, like I say, they canvassed a bunch of frontline workers, including healthcare and retail employees, as well as traditionally underrepresented groups, including Black, Latinx, and Native Americans. And there was 6 themes to what they had feedback about: concerns about the speed of the process, distrust in government, distrust
Yeah.
in the healthcare system, worries that politics and economics are being prioritized over science, fears of differing vaccine effectiveness for different populations. And we know that really different populations really need access as soon as possible, and fears based on past experience with the health system. I mean, it's
Yeah.
when you dig into it, it's really scary when you see that that's a group who really need, if that vaccine is available, to take it. But that
Yeah.
just this sort of huge, deep suspicion based on their historical perception of how they've been treated, etc.
Yeah, well, you saw those like initial polls that were like less than, I don't know, it was under 50% of the population wants to take a vaccine or would wait. And so now this is a really interesting read, John, around some of the frontline workers. And I'm going to share some of the comments that were made. These are some things that are, as somebody who's a big advocate of vaccines, I still can appreciate things like I firmly believe this is another Tuskegee experiment, and we are not going to be
Sure.
guinea pigs again, right? I don't know how much you know about the Tuskegee Airmen, but that was some really a dark moment in U.S. history. And then they say the more they study me, the more they know how to get rid of me. That's a little conspiracy driven, though. I don't think anybody's trying to get rid of people, but I also can appreciate, as they're if you're living in that sort of culture and it's been that way, then I can understand some of the skepticism. But we all know that no one's trying to eliminate a certain population. Um, but with that said, it also is, there's been another quote here. It says, when COVID first came out, I trusted the CDC websites and was sharing them from there. Now I can't trust the FDA and CDC. Much less, excuse me, now I trust them much less than when they first came out. And even I have some of that when all that flip flopping back and forth, like back in January, February, March timeframe, like, oh, travel's okay and masks aren't needed. And now we're like, forget travel, masks are needed. So there's a lot of skepticism around that. And, in defense of the people who have to make these rules, we just didn't know, right? Like, it's hard to say, right? As more data bits are, as we started to unravel this, um, the COVID disease and the mechanism of action, and realizing that it's affecting, the lungs and all sorts of different tissues. All of that helps to understand some of this distrust. And so when you hear, you catch the news on one night and you think you're good, and then say a couple months later you catch it again, it's the opposite message. It can be. I can see this, and it is worrisome, John. It is something where we don't want to have a day where there are millions of vaccines available and no one's taking them. But that's kind of what this is hinting at, right?
I think this is the issue that you've basically you got it in a nutshell. We've had to move fast to try and address this virus, but in this we're also trying to address it while we're still learning about it. So you're right. What changes, so your reaction to it changes. This article said not just was trust in CDC declining, but also the FDA. And unfortunately, the FDA, we've seen them flip flop on a couple of treatments where they sort of emergency use authorized it, and then later on said, "Hey, hold on, don't use it." And so it's that trying to make the correct decision, but you have to make it hastily, and then they're finding down the road that maybe that wasn't the right decision. But then the public perception of that's where your trust decline's coming from. It's a really tough balance, and we haven't got the balance right at the moment. Somehow, when the vaccines roll out, we have to message to people that these are safe, effective, and these are your hope of turning life around to get somewhere close to normal again, because we really have to get this under control.
Yeah, no, you nailed it. So we can go ahead and move on maybe to the next topic here, which is related to, will a small long shot U.S. company end up producing the best coronavirus, right, John? So this is the Novavax vaccine, which they very nicely tee this up and show like their stocks had plummeted and were really sort of struggling. They had some failures, but they've always been a pretty solid vaccine company. I mean, I had heard of them long before COVID hit, but now, man, a year later, where are they at? $2 billion from the U.S. government. Their stocks are skyrocketing. But more importantly, they're one of the 7, right, in our Operation Warp Speed. But more importantly is maybe the efficacy of the vaccine appears to be some advantageous stuff, maybe longer lasting. And I'm guessing here their cold chain isn't a problem, right, John?
Yeah, so this is a protein-based vaccine. So they use moth cells to produce the spike protein, which is at the heart of their vaccine. They produced a really strong antibody response in both monkey and early human tests, and that's where people are seeing that they are actually have done better than their competitors. It is again, they're following a proven technology. The hepatitis B vaccine it follows this approach. There was also a flu vaccine that followed this approach, approved in 2013, and the human
Papilloma, yeah.
HPV vaccine also follows this approach. Again, coming back to logistics, stable for many weeks at 2 to 8 degrees C. Novavax are tiny but rapidly growing, so they're hiring as many people as they can. But so they're actually reliant on contract manufacturers, which touched on something we talked about last week, where another of the vaccine developers are talking about how integral PPD were to their development process. So again, it's it's where us as CROs, here's where we can help. You may be small, but we can certainly, but by pooling our resources, we can make you effectively a much bigger, much more effective company.
Yeah, you mentioned those moth cells. It starts at a baculovirus level, which I know a lot about. That's the papilloma virus is definitely made in the baculovirus, and this one is the mRNA ones are fantastic, but this is the tried and true protein version. Without saying too much, I think you can understand that this is the one that to me, seeing how it is the vaccines that have historically worked without any or very minimal collateral damage, this is really promising as well.
So yeah, just a couple of late other points. The first phase 3 is in the UK, and their readout's expected early 2021. So it's still not far away.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, it's the only vaccine that had no viral replication in nasal swabs of vaccinated animals. So then that could possibly, if that's the case and that's true of humans, you could reduce the spread of infection on people who may be unaware that are even sick.
Yeah.
So this was also in that same article. So this could be this is definitely one to watch.
Yeah, no, and this is it's a company that's got some track record here in the vaccine space. So this is really I like this approach a lot, and really a good read if anyone wants to see it. It's in Science. It's pretty cool. Does a nice job of showing you how they make it and how it can protect you. Like you said, it appears to maybe potentially have that longer lasting effect due to, as you mentioned, the hepatitis, HPV, all those vaccines we know after an injection or 2 or 3, you're long lasting for life. So where the mRNAs are still TBD'd slightly. So great stuff, John. Really cool. Very happy that we've got, again, multiple vaccines out there. And so despite all this increases, where there's hope, but you still should social distance and wear a mask. So John, with that, maybe we'll move on to our next topic here as we wind down on our COVID.
Should we go with the last vaccine? This is early days on this one, but this is a different approach again, where it's actually University of Washington for Protein Design has a different approach. Professor there, a guy called Neil King, figured out modeling to design particles with software. That basically it's based on the observation that some viral proteins can spontaneously assemble into virus-like particles or VLPs. Although benign, they look like a virus, and the body recognises them as such, producing an immune response. And actually, Gardasil, the Merck's HPV vaccine, follows this approach. they've spun off to a company called Icosavax, and they've got backing from the Gates Foundation and Amgen. So this is a little bit. They're talking phase 1 in mid 2021. So this is more sort of almost next generation vaccine we're talking here. But really, I was not knowing anything about it. This is the sort of stuff. Oh, that's fascinating to think you can actually design the structure to deliver it and get it in. Could be, and the uh, preclinical studies sort of showing high rates of neutralizing antibodies, including from a single dose. So again, helping logistics if it's just one dose. So yet another one to watch. So
Yeah, really, it is, John, definitely. And this one is really in its early stages, but you said it's going to be in phase 1 by mid 2021. But it's one to keep an eye on for
yeah.
sure. And the other, you mentioned it's got Bill and Melinda Gates support, but Amgen's involved, and there's a name we haven't heard, a player we haven't really heard, who now is. I feel like they're throwing their hat in the arena here, and they are very good, in my opinion, on biologics and vaccines. So they're very good at their, I would imagine supply chain issues for them are maybe less of an issue. I think they have some great capacity and reach. So that's exciting that this University of Washington Institute for Protein Design has the backing of some major players.
So let's move on from vaccines. But I
Yeah.
agree with definitely that is a main topic one time. That'd be good. It also be a good chance to revisit the endpoints from
Sure.
38 to see where they all stand. But shall we move on to the
Yeah.
antibodies?
Maybe the antibodies are, yeah, you're talking about the Lilly when emergency use for,
Yep.
despite mixed data. This is all this great news is going on, and now you get the mixed one, right? So, yeah, go ahead, John. Tell us a little bit more about their emergency use.
The headline for this one is Eli Lilly win FDA authorization for emergency use COVID-19 antibody despite mixed data. Neither of us want to pronounce the name of the antibody.
Yeah.
So
Lycov 555, call it. How that?
it's there's been sort of articles on the TV about trying to pronounce it. It's called Bamlanit. Oh no.
Don't worry about it. I'm killing it. LY Cove 555.
Bamlanivimab for emergency use. Um, it's limited to patients 12 years and older who aren't hospitalised but at high risk of developing severe illness. I'm echoing. I've stopped. Okay, including elderly people and those with certain underlying conditions. And Lilly is advising infusion with 10 days of symptom onset. This. I mean, obviously, we want medicines to be available, but this is certainly a little bit of a confusing one to watch. I mean, it's the trial that it was based on that really has driven the emergency use authorization didn't show didn't show dose proportionality. So the EUA is based on the 700 milligram dose, but higher doses didn't show any different effect. It's
Yeah.
it's a confusing one, but
And
hopefully it helps someone. If it
yeah,
helps,
go ahead.
if it helps any people, that's great. I don't think it's not certainly not the panacea we're looking for.
Yeah. So a couple things. It looks like it shortened the hospitalization of about 3% from 10% placebo down to 3% in the treatment. So meaning they shorten the time in the hospital and so forth. That those are from 10 to 3 is it's a lot actually. I mean, and for those that I certainly want to reduce 7% of my hospital stay, but even from an economical standpoint, that's a lot when you think about how many people are hospitalized with this. But then the other thing that really kind of threw a flag, so to speak, like a wave of caution, is it's really somewhat ambiguous in how it's being used, right? So it's the specific lack of definition for high risk, right?
Sure.
Has one industry watcher. So it's kind of like, what does that mean, right? So no one likes in science having words like high risk, because that can mean something very different to me than it does to you. So that's it's interesting. These are the ones that are kind of it's got a big name behind it. It's got some name. It's got obviously, I think, some deep pockets, and let's hope it's effective. But clearly, these are the ones that kind of you hope we're not just rushing things through and trying to, are we going down the path of back to our favorite hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir when it was all exciting, and now we know those are less effective.
Sure.
All right. So, John, let's, if it's okay, we're going to do one non-COVID. This Silverback Therapeutics, right? This was an interesting little read. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it. My passion for immuno-oncology still lies high. They were able to make an IPO. They raised a whole bunch of money, but more importantly, their program SBT6050 targets toll-like receptor 8 in solid tumors that express HER2 genes. So, John, I don't know how much you know about the TLRs, but they were all the rage when I was in grad school. So in the early 2000s, they became, they still are some really critical parts of innate to adaptive immune systems, tons of redundancies, a lot of, people are still teasing out these toll-like receptor pathways, and if you study them, it's an incredible illustration of how much the immune system's evolved and the overlap and why we don't just simply get sick every time we breathe. But it's good to see somebody again engaging these things that I studied pretty heavily, and it's in the breast cancer space. So pretty cool. Thought it would be nice to just veer from COVID for a moment and let everybody know where there's still companies that are doing immuno-oncology work, and this one's actually an ADC, so it's a monoclonal antibody for the toll-like receptor along with a little payload on it. So really cool stuff, and thought it would be worth mentioning.
Yeah, we always like talking about ADCs because it sort of covers all parts of our business. I don't know what the payload is on this, but yeah, it'll be the usual cytotoxic small molecule.
Yeah, it doesn't say. Correct, it doesn't say.
Yeah, and yeah, we this it's been interesting, this podcast about the last 2 or 3 weeks. There's been so many changes in terms of status of COVID stuff. We've almost pushed the non-COVID to one side, but talking about things like this, it really is a reminder that the COVID, COVID's ongoing, so is an awful lot else. And,
Yeah.
for us, we're working on COVID programs, but it's still a pretty small proportion of what we're actually actively working on.
Yeah, it just takes the limelight, right? It's got the megaphone in its hand, but the amount of research being done in drug development, COVID's still a small portion of it, despite what's being poured into it. This had $100 million IPO, and this is just one. The great, we've talked about how are we doing during COVID? What's the market like? There's been a lot of activity in terms of IPOs, a lot of movement from company, a lot of good stuff going on in not only immuno-oncology space, but neurodegeneratives having some good stuff, NASH space. The more prevalent ones are all kind of moving along, and that's good, John. I think it's encouraging. Again, what I fear is the winter coming and some regression, but let's hope that we're prepared to avoid regression because we all know how to work from home now, right? So let's hope that happens.
Yes, absolutely. So shall we move on to the main topic? Okay, this is one we actually we started talking about possibly doing this 2 months ago, and as other things have cropped up, we've sort of said we'll do it a little bit later. We'll do it a little bit later, but now we're committing to it, and this is actually a discussion of the 2010 Fierce 15, where are they now? And just to give a bit of background, when we talk about news articles, an awful lot of our articles, we have to acknowledge this, come from Fierce Biotech and Endpoints News. And these are based on people who are obviously looking at press releases from companies, scouring the media and pulling it onto one place and sending out newsletters for the likes of us. We get them in our email inbox every morning. So that we get 3 or 4 of these emails, we go through them, and then there's a topic we can use. So it makes our research for the podcast really, really easy. So the Fierce 15, I assume that the 2010 must have been the first one, was really Fierce Biotech identifying 15 companies that they thought were going to be successes in the long term. So really looking into the crystal ball based on the technologies that the companies were working on, the indications and therapeutics they were working on, and just a general strategy trying to predict who would make it and who wouldn't. It's very interesting that you have those that are marked out as distinct successes, though there are a few that really didn't make it. But then there's the others where the bigger sharks are circling, and if this is one of the challenges of biotech, or it's actually where they want to go as well, where they produce a technology, but then they're bought out by a larger concern, and it's questioned whether that drug then progresses within the larger concern, or just what happens to the company thereafter. And I hoped we talk about this in the course of this discussion, but I just thought it was worth giving a little bit of background about what this is and why we want to talk about it, because the challenges for these biotechs also becomes the challenges for us as a CRO, because the changing status of a company affects our business too. So shall we? How do you want to? Do you want to walk through these one by one, Dominic, or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, let's start with those that are defunct. Let's talk about that. I think there's only one or two, those that have been acquired by bigger fish, so to speak, and then those that have actually made it, right? But this is a fascinating thing for you and I hope our audience enjoys it. But this is great to be able to look back 10 years ago, right? This is really cool to say, wow, where have they gone in the last 10 years? And I think it shines a light a little bit on the industry itself. But let's if it's okay with you, let's go with those that are gone. And I think the only one that sticks out is this Anchor.
Yep.
And I'm not familiar with them. So it says, I hadn't heard of them until we really dug in on this. They're gone as of 2013. So they somehow must have been a flash in the pan and then had been out of it. Is that right? Is that the only one of the 15 that's absolutely gone?
Yeah, there's a little bit more nuance to that. Certainly, Anchor were the only one who were independent and went out of business. So,
Yeah, but then the next tier, right, is those purchased, and there must be like 6 or 7 that have been purchased. So maybe we can talk about those a little bit, because again, Anchor back in 2013 being defunct, I don't know much about, but some of these purchased ones have certainly hit the radar map, right? Let's go down that list a little bit. How about Alder, right?
yeah,
That was purchased by Lundbeck, and so that's interesting because if memory serves me correct, Lundbeck's struggling a little bit. So I wonder. I couldn't find too much about Alder. I don't know what's happening there, and we can touch on it real briefly. But any thoughts on Alder? I think their technology is. It says in development here, but it's probably buried within some paperwork at Lundbeck.
So this talks to some of the dilemma of companies being bought out. So Alder, based in Washington State, Lundbeck are a Danish company. Lundbeck, I think, are more CNS, but Alder are antibody type research. Reading the fierce summary, I didn't dig into this too much. I think all Lundbeck are still using Alder's technology, and actually the planet, the Washington site is still going. So this is part of, they're seen as being Lundbeck's antibody hub for the longer term. I mean, this is one where, from our perspective, this would be a good situation. If we were working with Alder and then they were bought by the larger company, for them to remain going with the larger company, employing their same strategy, it means there's bigger pockets that can then fund the research, and it means that the relationship that we have with that company is still we're still going to benefit from that. Our relationship is likely to increase because there's deeper pockets to back the research up.
Yeah, that happens frequently, John. So what you're describing is a company like KCAS or a CRO will support the smaller entity, in this case, an Alder, and we'll support them bioanalytically, preclinically, maybe clinically. And then when it gets into a larger organization, typically, I'd say the majority of the time, those larger organizations work with us and stay on board because it's a lot of work to move the method to another lab, maybe their preferred vendor. But yeah, you're right. When these things happen, they tend to be, we have to work hard to ensure and instill trust with the bigger entity, but we tend to keep them, right? That's been our
That's
we've been around 40 years and 17 FDA audits. We certainly know what we're doing, but that rarely is there somebody who says we don't like you, we're gonna ship it off somewhere else.
Yeah, it's rare for it to be moved somewhere else, although sometimes the bigger company does have relationships, say preferred provider relationships, where they will move it.
Well, usually, even in those cases, they still use us just from
Yeah,
capacity restraints and things like that.
I agree. It's rare. It is definitely rare. The worst case scenario for us is when the bigger entity buys the smaller company, takes their technology and closes them down.
Yeah,
Uh, so that,
that
that's the worst thing, because not only have we lost, not only is our forecast changed for the worse, but the people that we were working with, that we built relationships, they may end up, they're going to end up they may end up unemployed, but they may go in a completely different direction, such that we don't have
yeah,
that contact anymore. And so yeah, that's definitely the worst case scenario for us. So I'll move on to the next one.
sure.
um, Amira is another of the buyouts, and so I was looking at these as what was a success, what was a failure. I rated Alder as largely a success because their technology is still active. Amira is the opposite of that. They were bought out, but their compounds largely went nowhere. Small molecule compounds, and they ultimately purchased by BMS, but the pipeline based on those compounds are dead. So that I would judge as a failure of the
Yeah.
15.
And the next one on here was Avila, which was purchased by Celgene, and another now BMS. So that's a second sort of BMS company that is their pipeline has largely been buried. And sometimes, John, I think companies will, and this is no surprise, right? They'll see the competition and say, "Wow, that might be a better product. Let's go buy it and bury it." And that can happen all the time. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think in any of these cases where they're buying they're thinking they're not going to go anywhere. There's definitely we trust you. We agree with your theory as to how the technology is going to work. Avila were another small molecule, but
Yeah.
sadly it went nowhere.
And then, John, and even in that case, you can envision as it gets purchased by Celgene, it needs funding. And then when BMS purchases Celgene, they're looking at this going, yeah, it's not going to make the budget, so to speak, right?
Yeah,
So
and
that, mhm.
yeah, you sort of go in that cycle of purchases where Celgene may have saying this is what we want to do with it, but then when Celgene's purchased by BMS, there's going to have to be a rationalization of the pipeline, and that's maybe where we look at the different assets and look at these assets. This is one that isn't going to go any further, and
So
that.
I think we kind of touched on the ones that are kind of getting largely dead, for better word. And then the next round of like those that got gobbled up tend to have gone on to have some. Well, there's one outlier here. Well, no, those that got gobbled up. The next one I'm seeing is this Plexicon, right? They got purchased by Daiichi Sankyo. Is that right?
So let's go with Hyperion first. It's
Okay, there it is. Yep, yep.
another BMS purchase. This time an antibody technology. So I rated this as mixed because purchased by BMS, pipeline largely dead, but one drug from a spin-off company is moving to approval. Um, so actually, I'm looking at this. Yes,
You- You're
right.
you're you're right. They are a mix because most of the pipeline dried up, but it looks like one of their drugs is moving on. So if I'm an Hyperion
Yeah,
founder or member, I'm still happy that at least something is still around versus the anchors and the Avilas and Alders of the world who are
sure.
probably dead.
Yeah, there's a couple of things still out there. There's a Biogen out licensed drug which is in phase 3, but I don't think there's a very optimistic outlook for it. It's looking at Alzheimer's, which is a um, very risky field to be in. But the one that's looking likely to go to approval is a Sanofi drug, or it's currently being developed by Sanofi, and it's heading for November approval verdict following priority review. So that, yeah, like I say, that's a partial success. Not too bad. The next one in terms of the buyouts, I would judge the success as Plexicon, purchased by Daiichi Sankyo, small molecule company focused on oncology. They've had one drug-resistant I'm looking at Excel and it's
Yep.
difficult to see between the cells. So the integral. So let me go back again. Purchased by Daiichi Sankyo, focused on small molecules, and although they're integral to Daiichi Sankyo's oncology strategy, even though Daiichi Sankyo gone. Daiichi Sankyo have been high profile in terms of their immuno-oncology. No, it's not immuno-oncology. Yes, sorry, the
Yep.
immuno-oncology candidates. They're making a lot of headlines with those, but actually the Plexicon pipeline is totally complementary to that. So they've got a fairly complete strategy in terms of how they're addressing oncology. So I judge that as success, even though it's swallowed up by another company.
Yeah, no, I would agree. They're in that. So I think when we're all said and done, maybe we'll post the 15 and we'll put a little bit of a blurb. So, Jeremy, we'll have something we want to give you that says, hey, we'll kind of try to keep it to 3 buckets, like success, mixed, for lack of a better word, unsuccessful. And so that they're falling into that successful stage. I
Yep.
agree with you.
Yep.
Um,
So, let's move on to another bot. One was tetraphase, and this is a very this really illustrates the risk in the pharmaceutical industry. This is an area where we need a lot of attention. It's so vital. Their focus was on antimicrobial resistance. Sadly, there's no money in it. So they've had one drug-resistant antibiotic approved, but because there's no revenue, they became like a bidding war to buy them out, and they're actually purchased by La Jolla. So there's been a number of biotechs have gone in this direction. They've shown very promising drugs to deal with antimicrobial resistance, but because there's so little revenue, a number of them have gone into administration, and it's I don't know what can be done to address that
Yeah, it's
imbalance.
a weird one, right? So
Yeah.
Tetraphase is, I believe they're still around as that
Oh, yeah.
name. Oh no, they're La Jolla. I see. They're a little bit of each, but I've heard of them in my passings. Certainly, the antibiotic resistant drugs are a hot topic. But you nailed it, John. It's like as I'm sitting here, I'm like, why isn't there more interest in this company, right? Like we need these things, but they're not. They have an approved thing, but no one's buying it. So that's an interesting kind of. What I'm trying to say is it's confusing to me why something so promising is struggling slightly, right? So I put it in this mixed state, but we're all worried about I guess COVID kind of jumped into the foray here and kind of made us forget about how our antibiotics are not working as well as they once did back in the 60s. So interesting. It maybe even something to think about topic wise to dig in on is where are we on that? Because it's sort of fallen off a little bit, right?
Yeah, like you say, there are other companies who've suffered exactly the same
Yeah.
fate. They've
So
had the drug
getting
approved.
approval, right? Getting approval, think you're successful, no money coming in. That
Yeah,
that hurts.
exactly.
Makes me think of Dendreon, if you know who they are in the CAR gene therapy space. But John, I think we've gotten through a good chunk of them.
The last of the bot outs is VentiRx. Again, it's funny how purchased by Celgene, now BMS, lead drug still in development but showing little progress. I say it's a small molecule bought out mixed. I suspect that will probably die on the vine and will then get the bought out failure. So let's move.
John, one last comment there. It seems like BMS looked at this list 10 years ago and said, I'm going to buy a bunch of these because they are dominating this scene here. It's really interesting.
Yes. Yeah. So let's move to the
we've got about 5 or 6 that are in the good space. Why don't we just start up top with Acceleron? Because this is they're a strong company. I'd put them as one of the more successful ones on here. Oh, wait, before we jump in there, there's one other outlier, John. It's this Kymab, right? They're the one. They're the ones in the legal battle with Regeneron. So that we touched on this in a previous podcast, right?
We have. Yeah.
It, it,
I think there's three that are mixed. I'll touch on those. Let's start with Kymab, and I'll add the other two.
yeah, I don't. I think they're in that like mixed category, but they're on the verge of, if they win that lawsuit, I mean, they could become a player in the drug development space, right?
Yeah, so the lawsuits are based on the use of the antibody producing mice and interpretation of patents, etc. And at least in terms of recent court cases, Kymab have been successful, so they are still moving forward. They have two candidates in clinical trials.
Mm,
Legal cases are mostly going their way, so I had them as a success question mark. So it's mixed because it's like. Could at some point they be halted, or
yeah, yeah.
will they be able to go? So it's yeah.
I think they're the first one we're going to put in that success category, but they also have that question mark due to this
Sure.
lawsuit.
Yep.
But really, I didn't realize how far back they dated, but it's interesting that, it's such a hot topic, right? Regeneron was way in the news with the president. All the technology they used, apparently, this Kymab claims they have some rights to. So
Sure.
interesting stuff.
So if I still in the mix, I'd say catabasis, and this actually is more. I would looking at the fear summary. I would have said tending towards success, but they have a rare disease focused mostly on muscular dystrophy, but their lead candidate has just failed their phase 3 in Duchenne muscular dystrophy in late October. So I think they're now at the stage where they're thinking, where do we go from here? So that'll
Yeah.
be one to they've sort of managed to keep going by themselves, but I'm not sure what that means for the long term. And the other one that I had as mixed was they were called 11 when they were part of the Fierce 15. As it turns out, their name is based on the Spinal Tap reference to 11. Turn everything up to 11.
What was that? Sorry, I didn't know. I didn't know they were referenced through Spinal Tap. Repeat that for me.
Yeah, if you look at the Fierce article, it basically says their original name 11 was in reference to Spinal Tap. And, it's like where Nigel Tufnell in an interview talks about how his amps can go louder because he can turn them up to 11. And
There
that's
it is.
so anyway, they're still going, but they merged and they're now called CSIN Bio. Um, they've had a number of failures in the past. Their stock price is around $1, but they have a lead candidate in phase 3. So large molecule company. I said, I judge them mixed for the moment. So one to watch to see which way they go.
Yeah, see, Catabasis and 11 fall into that category where they've been tumultuous, up and down, right? They've had some good news, bad
Exactly.
news, but I'm with you, John. I think both of these companies are, kind of, how do I say this gently? Because I don't want to have Jeremy cut me out, but I think they're running on fumes, John. How's that?
Sure. I tend to agree. So let's move to the 4 that we would definitely are still independent. We'd still judge to be successes. I don't think there's any other way to
Yeah, yeah.
look at them. So let's start with Accelerum. First drug approved, with others advancing in the clinic. So, I mean, it's. I think the first one's a fusion protein. I actually took less notes on this than I did for some of the others. So, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, John. The first one definitely a very interesting. Celeron is somebody who I feel like is on the ascent. They're very active. Their pipeline is very robust. They have, like you said, an approved drug for hematology. They have some. They're in the pulmonary space, and then a really neat candidate called ACE 1334 that is in the pulmonary space as well. So they a good mix, a good pipeline, and 10 years later seem to be standing alone, and they're not on the periodically I hear their name up for like purchase, but they seem to be in it to win it, and I think they're one of those companies that is going to be around for quite some time.
Yeah, agreed. The next one up is Adama, but when you read about them, are fascinating. Um, whenever I visit or ever when I hear about a biotech or a drug company, I immediately go to their website to find out about them and look at their pipeline because it's always interesting to see what they have what phase they're at, and really how many candidates they're advancing through. Adimab have a completely different model. They have drug approved, but really they're focused on antibody discovery and optimization, and they look at partnering or transferring technology, and they've done that to over 75 partners, and they've got more than 40 of their drugs are in clinical trials.
Yeah.
So GSK, Biogen, Novo Nordisk, Merck, Eli Lilly, and Takeda have all got Adimab's know-how active in their current programs, and
Yeah.
then as an additional part of that, Adimab have now spun out an additional company called Adagio Therapeutics to use that same technology to grow their own pipeline. In terms of everything on his list, this is a really, really amazing model, and
Yeah.
I'll pass it to you to talk
Yeah,
about.
so they fall into this, like what we call a platform company is what people would call them, where they kind of have this technology. And as you said, they've got like 350 programs. They're actually up to 80 partners is what they're saying now. You mentioned 75, and you're right, they're in 40 clinical programs. Most of these companies, I think, struggle. Not this one. This is great stuff, John. And they're in Lebanon, New Hampshire. So they're, to me, that seems, kind of not in the mecca of, say Cambridge, Mass, or San Francisco. They're in this, I don't know if you've ever been up to Lebanon, Mass, in Lebanon, New Hampshire. It's actually maybe not too far away from you. But you're right, John. They've got this. They're onto something. This is one of the strongest companies on this list. It's very impressive who they're working with, and kudos to this. I imagine they're a smaller size company, and good for them to stay in autonomous, and their model of like lending out their technologies or their platform is really one that I don't know it's worked all that well for companies, but certainly has worked very well for them.
Sure.
Yeah. We're rounding out our list, right? The next one I'm seeing is Dicerna, right?
Yep.
And we know a little bit about them too. Tell us about Dicerna, John.
So RNA-based technology, and again, it's doing a lot with partnerships, technology with large pharma, including Roche, Novo Nordisk, Lilly, Boehringer Ingelheim, and Alexion. Right now, the 3 drugs in clinical trials with their lead in phase 3, and RNA is really RNA several years ago was always that technology that we people thought there was potential, but we had nothing approved. There are now being approved RNA drugs, and so Dicerna will be all part of that wave to hopefully bring more to market. So I definitely see them as a success on this list.
Yeah, they're in many spaces. They've got a huge collaboration with some of those big players you mentioned. I'll add Alexion and Boehringer Ingelheim. They're working on in the NASH space. They complement a lot of things. It seems like their technology, RNAs, as we know, RNAis can be very diverse in what they target. It's just as simple as finding the right disease, whatever disease state, and then just augmenting and finding the RNA of interest and going after it. They're in the HPV space. They're in again liver and cardio, and then even complement with Alexion. So really diverse, and again, this is a really strong company, arguably the most successful on here to date. I think, but again, it's just my own personal little opinion. But really a strong company, John.
So we'll touch on the last one, and the way the Fierce 15 is structured. 14 come from Fierce Biotech. The last one comes from people who write in, and is obviously surveyed. And the audience at the time selected a company called Gelesis, and it was they have their lead product approved, and it's a food-based polymer that swells in the stomach to reduce appetite to help overweight or moderately obese people, seen as a safe alternative to surgery or weight loss drugs. So it's approved, and I don't know not sure what pipeline they have behind it, but certainly they successfully developed their technology to address an important need.
Yeah, they say GI related chronic diseases. Makes me want to take some, John, to be honest with you. But yeah, it's surprising that they've been around this long. Not something I wasn't that familiar with them, but again, they seem to be highly successful, and doesn't they're in the GI space, the NASH space, diabetic space, and then chronic idiopathic constipation, so CIC. So really, all in that microbiome space. That's a big area now, John, as we know, the microbiome. And not only is it big in the GI space, but a lot of immuno-oncology companies are starting to really focus on the microenvironment. And then I'll add in the neurodegenerative space, people believe your microbiome is playing a huge role in any sort of neurodegenerative diseases as well. Really cool. They do have a nice pipeline, John. They've got one approved drug, and then they've got what they call GS 100, 200, 300, and 500 in a variety of different preclinical and clinical studies. So really, this is high up there. I still give Dicerna sort of the win. So that's a good spot, John. Who's the best? Who do you rank number one? And then we can finish it up.
I'm giving the win to Adimab, actually, based on everything that I've been reading about. But I do want to say one more thing. The reason why I couldn't read my notes, this is terrible, but the reason why I rated Alda as Bota success, this is the Lundbeck purchase. They actually they have an approved drug that came from their technology, and it's one of the migraine drugs. So it's actually marketed as Vyepti. So it's a rival to the Lilly and Amgen drugs. I think right now it's seen as more of the niche amongst the three, but it does have the benefit. It doesn't have to be administered monthly like the Lilly and Amgen drugs. So I think it's a watch this space, but I do think that nudges them more towards the success than the buyout and failure, you know?
Yeah, I do. And the only reason why I agree, and why I think you're ranking Adimab above Dicerna is you're right. They're touching a lot more. But for me, they're a little bit reliant on others. So that's why I put like Dicerna and even a Celeron or the two that stick out. But this was a lot of fun, John. This was really a fun time.
Comes down to your business model, doesn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. You're, I think we're learning a little bit about each other every week, right? You're very comfortable with the diversification and having multiple partners and so forth. And I'm more in line with wanting to tote it myself. So anyhow, I'm kidding there. No, John, I feel like we're running a little long. I don't know if we have any feedback, but I think we're going to wrap it up just because we're hitting that 60-minute mark. But let's just quickly, John, tell me a little bit about your weekend and how's it all going. And I know you're doing some exciting stuff with your car.
That's next week, so I'm going to keep that under wraps till next week. Yeah, this weekend is not much planned at all for this weekend at all. I'm just glad to get to the weekend.
Yeah, I think we're all having that COVID fatigue. I don't know about you, but like I find myself really not wanting to go out. I know that sounds horrible, but it just the outbreaks and all of that are, I want to do my part, and so. Like you, I have very little planned this weekend. It's supposed to be pretty warm, so that's good. Even though we're in, the middle of the late part of November, so there's an opportunity. I might do some bike riding again. Last weekend, I got to did like a 20-mile bike ride, and that felt so good. Although even as I speak right now, I feel like my lower back tweaked a little bit. Anyhow, I like you have nothing exciting. My biggest thing is I got to get my 15-year-old son a car. If he doesn't have a car, that means I'm still carting him around. So. He's eligible. Last Tuesday of last week, he got his official driver's license, which means he can drive to school and any sort of practices. So I'll spend the weekend, and we're going to try and go down to the local Carfax and places like that, but nothing exciting. I do plan to do some cooking. I got a butternut squash teed up, trying to make either butternut squash soup or some Indian food. So look at that, John. That's really diverse for me, right? I didn't mention the word pizza, right?
That sounds right. Yeah. So in terms of the oven, I know it's in the area. We're just waiting for it to be installed now. So at least we've made progress on that.
Yeah.
But as regards, for me, the car thing is mostly next weekend. But I also have my VW, which had they had the walnut drop on it and crashing the hood. I need to actually go to a body shop and get that looked at and get an estimate and hopefully get that fixed and moving forward.
That's a lot of fun. You get to spend a lot of time to figure out how much it costs you. Yeah, but
there's things we have to do, but it's not a big weekend. This one, I think. Yeah.
And so for me, I am supposed to hit some golf balls too. I want to mention that, but that's my out is to go to a driving range because I feel like it's nice social distance. most of those places have outdoor places to grab a drink. So I still am trying to hang on to the outdoor stuff. But if you've been watching the news, all the big cities are bracing for, some grinding of some dips in the economy, some dips in unemployment as they no longer can sort of stay outside in downtown New York City when it's 25 degrees out, right? So I think there's some challenges there. But anyhow.
So we'll revisit that next week.
Yeah. So, John, enjoy your week.
Absolutely. You too, Dominic. Thanks very much for your time.